The content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose any medical condition, replace the advice of a healthcare professional, or provide any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Copyright 2020 Fireteam Whiskey, LLC, all rights reserved. Welcome to the Warrior Wellness Podcast, a podcast for military members, veterans, and first responders focusing on fitness, health, nutrition, and biohacking. Our mission with this podcast is to introduce America's heroes to lifestyle habits and hacks that will help them live healthier, happier lives, and in turn, be fit enough to continue their support of their communities and country.
All right, welcome to the Warrior Wellness Podcast, and we have Steph Shaughnessy with us, who is the Secretary of the Northeast Florida chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And so I know this is a kind of a tough topic for people to hear about, to think about, but unfortunately, almost all of us have had our lives touched by suicide or someone that we love and care about who has suffered with mental health issues. So, and the cool thing about Steph is that not only is she a former police officer and is married to a police officer, but she is, her role within the AFSP, she is throwing a suicide prevention awareness event in November in Jacksonville, Florida. So I'm sure she'll touch upon that too. So let's get started. Thank you so much for being here, Steph.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate this very much.
So I just wanted to first kind of start off asking you, kind of what led you to taking on this role with the AFSP?
Honestly, a lot of it initially stemmed from my experience in law enforcement, because I was sworn in 3 months to the day exactly after September 11th happened. And it was just a very different time. I was only 21, 22. And I really had no concept of mental health issues. I had mental health issues, family members with mental health issues, and we never talked about it, didn't really think we were but I really had no concept of mental health and how I would be so associated with that, doing that law enforcement job, just having it, such a prevalent part of my job every day. People struggling with mental health issues and suicides and suicide attempts. And so it really opened my eyes. And one of the first time that our chapter was actually created in Jacksonville, one of the first annual walks that they did, it's called Out of the Darkness for Suicide Prevention, they did in Jacksonville Beach. And that's where I was an officer at the time. And I initially just signed up to work the walk just to provide them extra security. But I just really fell in love with the people that were doing it at the time and started volunteering. And that was over 10 years ago. So I've been a part of the chapter ever since. And along the way, throughout 20 years later in law enforcement, I'm no longer in it. I was in it for almost 15 years, but my husband's in it. And we've lost, friends to suicide, law enforcement officers, people we knew. So I just really appreciate us having this conversation where, law enforcement and military go hand in hand. And it's a lot of the same topics and issues. So.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch upon just, for people who maybe are not aware, how terrible an issue. Suicide's a terrible issue in itself, but how much more prevalent it is within the first responder community, even more so than the military veteran community, which is surprising to a lot of people. So I'm just going to read some statistics here. So 2 times, so we always think of like police losing their lives, in the line of duty, and these are always unfortunate deaths, but most people don't know that there's a double amount of police suicides than losing their lives in duty. And that in itself is crazy surprising. PTSD and depression are 5 times higher than the general population in first responders. Firefighters die by suicide 18 out of every 100,000. Police die by suicide 17 out of every 100,000. And the general population is 13 to 100,000. So the rates of suicide in police and firefighters are much higher than the general population, which most people don't realize that. So, why do you think that this is such a prevalent issue within the first responder community?
I think, I think a lot of it is obviously the trauma and the different things that you experience in working in those capacities, whether you're a law enforcement officer, a firefighter, or a military member of the military. I think it's just long-term, a lot of them suffer from PTSD. I had read a statistic years ago that said police officers alone witness more trauma on an annual basis in some time, which is just crazy. And we've gotten a little bit better about it. I can't speak to the military, but I know with law enforcement agencies across the nation, they are getting better with implementing peer support teams and, crisis training and trying to do any kind of interventions they can, but it's still not enough. And along with what they experience in this job, it's typical to not want to talk about when they do start struggling. It's so typical to not want to admit that you're not okay, that maybe you're not sleeping, or that you are struggling. I think that goes across the board for all of the men and women in those fields. They're just not good at raising their hand to say that they need help.
Yeah. So what do you think, that, any layperson listening to this can do, or even if you are currently, a law enforcement officer or military member or firefighter, what are some kind of practical tips that you can give, the people listening to help, contribute to helping people who are struggling with this, or maybe they themselves are struggling with this?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the big things is doing just what you're doing with this, having a conversation about it. And because, that continues to create a culture where we can talk about it and have these conversations and kind of, open that door where we can say, listen, let's talk. If we're not okay, let's talk. The more you talk about it, the more prevalent, we can let everyone know how crazy high these numbers and statistics are, and that this is preventable. This is totally preventable. So I think the more we continue to have conversations, that's number one. I think it's important to know, just to understand the signs of suicide, and it's not foolproof across the board that in black and white that every single person will exhibit these types of signs, but for the most part, they've narrowed it down to different things that have to do with the person's behavior and mood, increased use of drugs, alcohol, somebody who just, if you can tell, somebody that you're working alongside is become a little bit more quieter, maybe out of their routine, not as talkative, signs and symptoms of depression, just like they're struggling. And for the most part, for those of us in uniform, I think a lot of us, maybe not all the time, but a lot of us can tell when somebody next to us is struggling a little bit, and just not being afraid to say, and being able to come right out and ask directly, have you had any thoughts of killing yourself? Have you had any thoughts of suicide? I mean, coming right out and just being direct and asking, I think is so important too.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that because, I'm a licensed mental health counselor and worked in military mental health for 10 years. And I remember we all went as a group to, it's called assist training. So it's a form of, assisting and preventing suicide. So in this class, we were all mental health providers. And I remember the teachers went around and just said, okay, I'm your client. You ask me, if I'm suicidal. I remember there was only 2 in a group of about 25 licensed mental health providers who actually came right out and used the S word.
Yeah.
they actually, I was one of them, because I worked in the prison system. So, I was already trained in that area. But, just saying, are you thinking about committing suicide? Have you thought about killing yourself? And even trained, licensed clinicians, quote unquote trained, couldn't bring themselves to say it. So we have a really long way to go with the stigma issue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes, we've come a long way, but we definitely do have a long way to go. And I think it's so important to say the word, and to have, AFSP likes to call it like a real convo, to have a real conversation. Are you thinking about suicide, and saying the word? And I appreciate you mentioning the walk. This is one of probably one of our biggest fundraisers here. We are in, AFSP is in 50 states. We have chapters in 50 states across the nation. And ironically, I had never heard of them, even being in law enforcement for years. When I first became a part of the Northeast Florida chapter, that's the first time I had heard of the AFSP. So I do want to say that they are the leading national organization when it comes to research, prevention, education, and for suicide prevention. And we do these walks every year. It's called Out of the Darkness, and we're doing one in Jacksonville, Florida, where I live, in November. We're trying to get the date nailed down. I believe it's going to be the second weekend of November, but we usually shoot for November before the holidays start. And anyone that would like to come out, be a part of it, volunteer, have a table, I mean, we'd love to have them, because it's a great cause. And last year we were able to raise over $100,000, which has been, but AFSP has they have a pretty bold goal by 2025 with the impact they want to make on suicide prevention. So this is the place where we do it.
Yeah. And we will, in the show notes for the podcast, I'll put the link to your fundraiser. So if people don't live in Jacksonville and you're listening to this, you can at least maybe, put a little, what you can, and donate to this great cause. Before we close out, we have a few more minutes, but, I'm always about kind of making sure that we, leave our audience with very practical, things, practical steps to take. If, let's segment it into two types of groups. So let's say a person who's listening to this is struggling with thoughts about suicide or thoughts about killing themselves, or maybe they've even attempted in the past, and they're really struggling. Where can they get help?
If you are absolutely struggling and you want to talk to someone, you can dial 1-800-273-TALK, 1-800-273-8255. 273-8255, and veterans can press 1 for that. That's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline that will put you in contact with somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so you can actually talk to somebody. You can also text TALK to 741-741, and you can text with a trained counselor if you prefer that method of communication. And I really urge people, if maybe you're not at that level, maybe you're just in a place where you just need to talk to somebody, especially for first responders. But I know with a lot of companies and corporations out there could be resources that you can access for free through your employer, and I know in law enforcement, we had an employee assistance program that was private and confidential, and you can just start there, so I would suggest that.
Yeah. And, the misnomer, especially with the population that we're talking about, with military and first responders, and firefighters even, is that you're going to be taken off you're off of duty because, you're struggling with these things. And, I always say, well, just don't assume, because I've seen literally thousands and thousands of soldiers and airmen struggling with these issues. And I could probably count on 2 hands out of those thousands who actually got, taken off of duty, or, or kicked out, so to speak, because they, mainly and generally had a very, very severe form of mental health issues. Most branches, most first responder branches, give you the resources and then give you the time to recover before there's any thought of any of those things. Am I correct?
Yes, very much so. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Correct.
So
And I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that, because that is the assumption, I think, of several of them that keeps them right where they're at, is they're afraid to start, and because they're afraid to that they're going to lose their job.
right. So, and it's also kind of, I'm putting on my psychotherapy hat right now. It's very much a kind of a conflict, right? When you're saying, well, I don't want to get help because I don't want to get taken off of duty. But guess what? If you're dead, you're not on duty anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If you, you're obviously going to continue to get worse. This isn't going to magically get better. So that's, get rid of that thought out of your head. If you're listening to me right now, and this is something you've been struggling with, and usually you've been struggling with this for a very long time and been keeping it very quiet, it's not going to magically disappear. You do need to do the work to get, just like with health and fitness, you can't just, I can't just magically say, I'm going to have an 8-pack abs tomorrow. It's just not going to magically happen, right? I have to do the work to get those abs, right? So it's the same thing. If you're struggling with depression, anxiety, or suicidal thoughts, it's not going to magically go away. You have to do the work. But using excuses that I'm going to get taken off of duty or I'm going to lose my job is kind of silly, because if you continue down this road, you're going to get to a place of no return. And unfortunately, maybe you're not going to, to be able to continue in this manner. So let's talk about that second group. So we talked about a person who's feeling like they are wanting to harm or kill themselves, and some resources to get help. What about some tips? I know we had already talked about asking the person you're concerned about, whether or not they're thinking about suicide. So let's go one step further, and let's say the people listening, they got up the courage to do that, and the person said, yes, I am thinking about that. Now what?
Thank you for asking that. One other resource I wanted to mention was just reaching out to your regular health provider. Your doctor, you just want to start there. I think having a real conversation with your friends to say, I will walk this road with you. I will help you every step of the way. These are some resources. These are people that can help you to do it with you. I think one thing I want to say is if somebody raises their hand and actually tells you yes, you got it, don't let that opportunity pass you by to really grab a hold of that person, you know what I mean, and say, I'm here to help you, and let me point you in the right direction or help you with this, because I would never want you to feel like, well, maybe they're okay. Have a good talk with them. I mean, like of the fact that they were honest and open enough to tell you where they're at. And so I would say, with the same steps with dialing the crisis line or going through your the text to talk options, your mental health provider, and your regular doctor, just getting the next step and doing that with them for sure.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So, kind of carrying through, and the acronym in the Army, it was ask, care, escort. So, actually asking the question, caring enough to hear what they have to say and tell their story. And then also escort. So get them, do what we call the warm handoff to a person who can provide care. So whether it be, a chaplain, or a medical provider, or just picking up the phone and calling 1-800-273-TALK, physically just make sure that happens. And if it can't happen at that moment in time, then have a plan in place where they can be safe until that can happen.
Yes. Yeah, I just, under no circumstances would I leave them alone, no matter what, and just stay with them and be there for them. But that's why I say to link arms and walk them through that, because it's great that they admitted it to you, but I would definitely not leave them by themselves and not take that opportunity to try to stay with them, present with with them until they are in front of a mental health professional.
Right. And, and I think the biggest obstacle is just having the courage to ask and, express that, I'm just asking because I care, that's really all you have to say is I'm concerned about, what I've been observing about, what's going on with you. I'm concerned and this is why I'm asking. So if they get mad at you, they get mad at you. I'd rather ask the question and have them get mad at me than never ask the question and then, have maybe that person end up, doing something terrible to themselves or have something happen. And then, really living with that regret that, I did notice those things, but I never followed up and just, had the courage to ask.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that because that's something that, you're coming from a place of, I love you. I care about you. This is not, there's no judgment. This is just me looking at you asking, is this something that you've considered? Because if so, I'm here for you. And just to hold that space for your fellow, your partner, your zone buddy, your, who you are working alongside in the military or whatever, in whatever capacity that you work with them, just letting them know that there's no judgment and I'm just here to help, but we've got to have the guts to ask and we've got to have the guts to say the word. Yeah. So I think that's, thank you for saying that. So important.
Yeah. Yeah. Rather than be mad at you than no longer with us. Right.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, I appreciate you so much, Stephanie, for joining us and talking about this very, serious topic, but it's important that we talk about it. So, people can get some practical steps to know what to do if they encounter this issue, and they can maybe, help save the life of somebody they really love.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for creating this space. So, and having this conversation, inviting people in to continue this conversation with you is half the battle out there with suicide prevention. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And we'll put your all your links and your contact information in the show notes about the Out of the Darkness Walk and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Warrior Wellness Podcast. And we would love for you to subscribe to us on iTunes or Spotify and go ahead and leave us a review. And if you screenshot your review and send it to info@fireteamwhiskey.com, we will send you some awesome Fireteam Whiskey swag just to thank you for your review.